This is, I think, the most gut-wrenching reading in the cycle, but it's, I think, also therefore, and maybe the most necessary. So I think there's a lot for us to grapple with at a visceral level, and I think the importance of the great conversation really proves itself when we have to deal with these darkest of matters in the history of humanity. We have to deal with a little bit of history, I think, because this history is not as well known as it ought to be. The rise to power of Hitler and the Nazis, the National Socialists in Germany, was consolidated in 1933 with Hitler's appointment as chancellor. And soon thereafter, the Reichstag, the parliament of Weimar Germany, was burned. And that was the occasion for the passing of a Reichstag fire decree that eliminated many basic civil liberties, and was then used as a jumping off point for the enabling act that gave Hitler his dictatorial powers. So that was 33, obviously, was the time that the collapse of German civilization began, in political earnest anyway. And that's when Hannah Arendt kind of woke up, and she started to work with forces trying to resist, and the Gestapo arrested her, and then she had to flee. Other highlights or lowlights, whatever, in this dark history, we have 1938 Kristallnacht, the pogrom that was a very sinister foreshadowing of what would come. But what we really need to know, as far as the execution of what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question. So we've seen this turn with the reading from Marx. This was an explicit question in the mind of, well, not Jews, right? It was the question in the minds of those who were looking upon the Jews as if they were a problem. They were the question to be solved. There's a quote I came across recently from W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, in a different context, but he talking about the American community, but between me and the other world, there is an ever unasked question: how does it feel to be a problem? Whenever a community is treated as if they're a problem, obviously there's a great danger that something very bad is going to happen. So this final solution of the Jewish question could not have occurred, though, without the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. These were mortal enemies at the time. I mean, it made no sense to anybody except, well, Stalin and Hitler. But it allowed for the joint invasion of Poland in September 1939, and that began World War II. And that also began the possibility of these mass killings. And what Timothy Snyder, in a very powerful book that I've started reading, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, that the Bloodlands is his term for the area from central Poland to Western Russia, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. This is where 14 million people were murdered by the Nazi and Soviet regimes in the years leading up to and including World War II. These were not casualties of war. That would increase the number by a lot. These were casualties of ideological murder. Slavs and Gypsies, and of course, above all, Jews were slaughtered in numbers we've never seen in history before. You had the Ukraine terror famine by the Soviets. You had the starving of, I think, 3 million captured Russian soldiers by the Germans. And then, of course, you had the psychotic pursuit of Jews from all over Europe. And when we talk about Auschwitz as kind of a symbol of the final solution, that's the most famous site in the Bloodlands. But the fact is, the final solution it only occurred in these territories. And it was Eichmann's job to manage the bureaucratic details of so-called forced evacuation of Jews from all over Europe. Wherever the Nazis were able to gain control, they began this process of forced evacuation to the Bloodlands, where the killing actually happened. When American and British forces reached Germany, they came across concentration camps, and that was horrible enough. But They actually never reached the killing centers of the Bloodlands. The Red Army was the force that it got in there. And so that's important because that's part of the reason we don't know this history as well as we should. We don't have, there was, when it went from Nazi control to Soviet control, obviously it was not an increase in transparency. That joint invasion of Poland in 1939, that alliance between the Soviets and the Nazis did not last. As we know, the Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941 was Hitler's betrayal of Stalin and his invasion of the Soviet Union, which really ramped up the killing in all kinds of ways. So the goal was to render the world Judenrein. That's the term that you've seen in the reading. It means to purify of Jews, and it was, there was no war aim involved. It was Hitler's desire simply to destroy this race. This was put into place. The final solution was activated soon after the invasion of the Soviet Union. It's important for us to grapple with the totalitarian matrix here of the killings, because even though we don't see the same kind of, well, I mean, in China, there is still a lot of killing going on. So I guess that's something we have to grapple with. But what Hannah Arendt was so worried about is that once a crime has been introduced in the world, and she thought this was new, one of the reasons she disliked the way the prosecution of Eichmann was handled is that she thought it was being presented as if this was the latest and the worst of the pogroms that have bedeviled the Jewish community throughout history. And she was saying that misses the fact that there's something new here. And once a new act has been introduced into history, once a new crime has been innovated, it means it makes it possible for that thing to happen again. So even though we don't think this is as likely, she's saying, and this is part of why she thought the handling of the charges against Eichmann should have been dealt with differently, is that humanity is endangered now because this possibility has been realized by the Nazis. I do think she's right about that. The controversy about the book, which I allude to in the introduction, is that, and this often came from people who did not read the book, but on two fronts, right? That she pointed out, following other historians, she pointed out the collaboration of certain members of the Jewish leadership and the carrying out of the final solution. Others wanted to make Eichmann into a mastermind of the final solution, which seems a little absurd given his obvious mental incapacities. I mean, he just wasn't mastermind material. He was the head of section B4, and that already indicates he's a lower level functionary essential to this process. I mean, he headed up the deportations. He did before the war. They were forced deportations and then forced evacuations, as they called it, after the war began. Section B4 of the RSHA, which was the head office for Reich security. And just a little more background before we get into this. The SS, Himmler's creation, the Schutzstaffel, the protection squadron, that was the paramilitary force of the Nazis before they gained power. And once they came into power, Himmler eventually integrated the paramilitary, the party thugs, with the state police forces. And that's always a very ominous thing when party and state get mixed together. It's one of those junctures where anybody in any regime needs to look very carefully what's going on when party and state get melded. So Himmler, the SS is the criminal organization that was most responsible for the execution of the final solution. And as far as something just that might be useful as a way in for those of you who have studied moral theology, the question here can be reduced to one of material cooperation. That is, Eichmann himself, it does not seem actually directly killed anybody. So the question is, if you're not the operator of a murder, but the co-operator, how do you assess guilt, right? It's clear, it seems to me, that Eichmann was, of course, what we would call an immediate material cooperator with this evil. So that makes you actually equivalent to the one who operates the evil. Emma, do you mind reading the questions out?
In Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt denies every one of us the security of self-satisfaction. Why, for Arendt, Arendt, is it important not to remain silent in the face of ideological falsifications, even within a victimized community? Why does she insist that we continue to attend to all the facts, no matter how discomforting, and to disavow slogans in favor of thinking, even when thinking is most unpopular? 2, why is holding success, winning, or even mere survival in the struggle for existence as the measure for action so corrosive to conscience? How can conformism foster cruelty, whether the conformisms be conservative, progressive, bourgeois, etc.? If one's social world has gone morally insane, what resources remain for discerning how we should live? What is the true basis of law and its obligations? What is problematic about playing along with the game of scarcity, in which a few are privileged and the rest are allowed to sink? How does one class shape the outcome of the game? Number 4, on the one hand, Arendt raises the terrors of totalitarianism are unprecedented in history. On the other hand, she would have us lift the Nazi mirror to our own faces. What danger is posed by figuring Nazi horrors as completely exotic?